Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Smoke and Mirrors by Denver Murphy. Narrated by Chris Macdonnell. Prologue. They say that time is the great healer, and with Brandt dead, and consequently her sole remaining purpose in life having now gone, Stella Johnson had plenty of time on her hands. Yet in the weeks since Brandt's second visit to her house, only her physical wounds had healed. The doctors had told her that she was lucky she would only suffer a couple of discrete patches of long-term scarring, but they were only talking about what they could see. Far more damaging had been the injury she suffered the first time Brandt visited her house, the death of the man she had started falling for. On that occasion, P.C. McNeil had saved her from former Chief Superintendent Jeffrey Brandt, the serial killer they had hunted for months, but in so doing he had been fatally stabbed. McNeil's death and Brandt's subsequent escape weren't the only causes of her pain. Equally bad was the knowledge that she was responsible for them both being there that night. In her desperation to catch Brandt, she had instigated the publishing of a newspaper article that suggested he had been preying on young women to hide that he was a closet homosexual. He had tracked Johnson down to prove to her firsthand that the allegations were untrue, stripping her and tying her to the bed. He was about to rape her when McNeil arrived. McNeil had been to her house just once before, and that was only because she was driving with him to Canterbury to see whether a murder there was linked to the killings they were investigating in Nottingham. But it was in Canterbury where their association had begun crossing over from professional to personal. Had it not been for some crucial evidence being discovered as they made their way back into the hotel that night, it was highly probable that Johnson would have slept with her younger colleague. Her determination not to lose focus in her pursuit of Brandt had made that moment the closest they'd ever come to becoming physical. Brandt, denying her the blossoming relationship with McNeil, had seen Johnson return to work far sooner than she was mentally ready. She may have successfully lied her way through her occupational health interview, but her boss, DSI Potter, had not been fooled. Resolutely keeping her away from the hunt for McNeil's murderer and leaving it to D.I. Fisher, who appeared to be falling for the false trail left by Brandt, Johnson decided to go it alone in her search for justice. After tracing him to the Spanish seaside resort of Benidorm, but failing to lure him into a trap there, she found herself with little option but to revisit the strategy that had drawn Brandt out the first time. Coercing his ex-wife into agreeing to an interview that would seemingly confirm the earlier rumours, she lay in wait for his return to Nottingham. But just as her past actions had inadvertently led to the death of another, Brandt had lured her out under the pretence that she could save his ex-wife when, in reality, he had killed her hours before. Johnson had eventually awoken in her kitchen, tied to a chair, and with Brandt pouring petrol around the room. She had derived little satisfaction from managing to escape the resulting blaze as he perished within. Although nothing would bring McNeil back, Brandt denying her the revenge she craved had left her feeling empty. The thought of killing Brandt herself had been the one thing that had kept her going. As far as she was concerned, all she was now left with was a destroyed house and a career she no longer wanted. What Johnson didn't know was that Brandt had left her with less than that. The charred remains of the body dragged from the house weren't his. Chapter 1. As the bus from Canterbury swept down the hill into Whitstable, and with the blue-grey sea now visible beyond the houses on his left, Jack pushed thoughts of everything else to one side and concentrated on the task at hand. With no experience of murder, either directly or indirectly, Jack knew his greatest chance of getting away with it would be to make himself as unnoticeable as possible. This wasn't just in terms of the location of the killing itself, but his movements in the surrounding areas. He had alighted at the stop before the odd industrial unit turned into the main thoroughfare of shops. Jack knew little about the deployment of CCTV, but suspected a quiet seaside town such as Whitstable was unlikely to have much coverage outside the very centre. That his route to the beach would take him close to his grandmother's old house was a coincidence. He wondered how his parents, and most of all his grandmother, would feel if they could see him now and knew what he was planning on doing. It wasn't too late to change his mind. He could simply turn around and catch a bus back home, putting all this behind him. But Jack knew the truth. On what should be a day for celebration, with less than an hour passing since he finished his final A-level exam, Jack couldn't look to the future with this still hanging over him. He was certain he could find the strength to turn around, but equally knew it would merely postpone the inevitable. This had to be done. Jack carried on walking, and instead of thinking of his family, he turned his attention to the man who had inspired him, Brandt. Had he ever experienced such doubts? Jack liked to believe that he hadn't, but even if he had managed to overcome them, a fact which to Jack was a source of strength. Not that Jack felt he would have to worry about this. He had no intention of making a career out of murder. This was to be a one-off, just something that would enable his mind to settle and allow him to focus on the long summer ahead, so he could begin looking forward to his adult life. He reassured himself that much in the same way he had quickly lost interest in his internet searches years ago, he would be able to put thoughts of death behind him after this. Having delivered it firsthand, his previous fantasies would sufficiently pale by comparison to render them pointless. Feeling much better, Jack found himself able to concentrate solely on the present, a discovery that coincided with his arrival at the short alleyway that took him directly onto the beach. He slowed his pace, enjoying the narrow view his confined sight gave him of the water. From here the sea seemed infinite, and Jack found the expanse comforting in its vastness. It made him feel small, and by the same virtue, so too the act he was about to perform. He had read recently that with a global population now well in excess of 7 billion, a person dies in the world every half a second. In this context, what he was going to do was wholly insignificant. In fact, Jack didn't really believe it was adding to the statistic. Given he knew he couldn't move on with his life until the deed was done, it wasn't so much ending someone else's life as trading theirs for his. He wouldn't know the background of his victim, but he felt confident his life was worth more than theirs. Not only was he young, and should be allowed to look forward to many happy years ahead, but he was an able and intelligent person who could well go on to make a valuable contribution to the world. Whoever he was going to find walking aimlessly along the beach when they should be at work was clearly not as important as him. Taking a deep breath, he emerged from the alleyway, the crunch of the shingle underfoot signaling his arrival at his destination. Reaching into his shoulder bag, he touched the knife for the first time since placing it there that morning. It was one of the smaller blades from the wooden block that stood proud on the marble work surface, and was the closest he could find in size to the steak knife used in the attacks in Nottingham and Canterbury. A serrated edge would have added to the authenticity of the experience, but Jack reassured himself that he was only seeking to take inspiration from those events. He was going to bring it out and attempt to hold it discreetly, perhaps the handle reversed so it would sit up his forearm. But as soon as it was exposed to the sun's rays, the reflection shone in his eyes. He cursed himself, knowing that his hero wouldn't make this kind of mistake. It mattered not to Jack that there wasn't anyone within sight. Schoolboy errors like this would see him caught. "Stop pissing about," he muttered to himself, and continued to trudge along, the sound of his footsteps matched only by the gentle tumbling of the waves and the gulls calling out overhead. This was not at all the experience Jack had been expecting. He thought he would be feeling pumped, energized by the sheer thrill of finally experiencing a death he had created. Instead, he felt out of his depth and, despite the familiarity of the setting, lost and far from home. He still wanted to kill, but this was more about getting the deed over and done with than any kind of watershed moment in his life. It would have to be the very first person he encountered. Any notion of selecting his victim would only give him more time in which to lose his nerve. Jack stepped over the wooden groin and spotted a person headed in his direction. All he could make out from this distance was that they were male and seemed of average build. Jack would have liked a woman, and not just because of the synergy it would create with the other attacks. He felt it would give him more of a chance to overpower his victim if things didn't go smoothly. However, his own physique was strong, if not overtly muscular, and he reassured himself that a man would be less wary of a stranger approaching. Similarly, selecting this particular man gave Jack one significant advantage. He was alone. Jack wasn't intimidated by dogs, but he knew that some breeds could be very protective of their owner, and, even if they weren't, the sort of barking that his actions may provoke could draw unwanted attention. Even though luck had seemed to bring him a suitable person, Jack didn't like the speed with which their travel was converging. A few minutes earlier it may have seemed like his whole life had been building up to this point, but now it was upon him, it all felt too rushed. As Jack stepped into the groin field the man had entered a few moments before, he became convinced that the best course of action was to merely pass him and take the next turn off back towards the main road. It no longer mattered that he would regret this action to the point of finding himself drawn to kill at a later date. At least today he could try and continue his life as normal. It may torment him, but he could attempt to deal with the pain, perhaps seek counseling. Maybe he should just tell his parents. He knew the revelation, which wouldn't include anything about this visit to Whitstable, would deeply disturb them, but it was their job to support him. Rather than help him secure a summer job so he could raise extra cash for going to university in October, they could send him somewhere that would allow him to get over these thoughts. And that's all it was at the moment, just thoughts, irrespective of what he was about to do. Jack had read about plenty of celebrities going into rehab for drink or drug-related problems. Perhaps there was something similar that could help him. He stopped walking. He knew exactly what that place was. His parents would send him to a mental hospital. If he went home now and waited for them to return from work, only to tell them that he wanted to kill someone, they'd first laugh nervously as though believing he was cracking some kind of dark teenage joke they didn't understand. But once they realized he was serious, they would have him sectioned. They would convince themselves they were being supportive, but really what they would do is what they had always done when faced with a problem. They would have someone else deal with it, and preferably quickly enough so that neither the neighbors nor their friends at the Rotary Club would notice. "Are you okay?" The question startled Jack, and he raised his head to see the man staring at him with a look of concern. Like with most young people, Jack was pretty useless identifying the age of people comfortably into adulthood, but, with no signs of grey in his dark brown hair, nor any prominent wrinkles, he guessed the man to be somewhere in his 30s. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked. "I was just walking past, and you seemed a little troubled," the man replied. "No," Jack said calmly. "Why are you here?" He could see his question wasn't understood, and so decided on a different approach. "Why aren't you at work?" "Excuse me?" The confusion in his voice was matched by the couple of steps he took away from Jack. "Don't you have a job?" "Well, I guess I could ask you something similar, but if you must know, yes, I do, and I'm going to it now." "What do you do?" Jack asked, reaching into his bag. "I work at the Cross Keys," he replied impatiently. "I'm running late, so if you don't need help or anything, I'd better get going." "Wait, hold on," Jack cried, causing the man to turn back. "I do need your help with something." He withdrew the knife, a little unsure of what to do with it next. Fortunately for Jack, the sight of the blade only caused the man to pause and look at him with bewilderment. The moment of inactivity was brief, but felt an age to Jack. There was no going back, but his arm wouldn't move. It was as if the knife was a dead weight. Look, whatever it is, it can't be as bad as all that. Jack opened his mouth to ask him what he meant, but closed it again. He could feel a rare emotion building inside him. Anger. This man just viewed him as some unstable kid. An unstable kid who has skipped school and was threatening suicide as some pathetic cry for help. I bet he never had to deal with this shit. I bet he never had his victims patronizing him, Jack muttered. Who are you talking? Jack had silenced the man before he could complete his question. They both stared at the knife's hilt protruding from his chest. Jack found the bloom of blood that was spreading out mesmerizing, especially the way the material of his white T-shirt was greedily soaking up the moisture. It was proving an effective sponge. He looked up to see the man's eyes wide with disbelief and could feel his manners compelling him to apologize. But this was no error. It may not have been planned, but Jack had come to this place in order to do something specific, something that had yet to be completed. He reached for the handle. "Don't!" the man gurgled, and blood bubbled on his lips. Jack smiled. Any reassurance it conveyed was not designed to bring the man comfort. Instead, it was a surety that blasted away his earlier reticence. This was not only right, but what he was meant to do. As Jack withdrew the blade, his smile turned into a grin. The material of the man's top couldn't cope with the increased flow, and blood started dribbling in rivulets. The grin turned into a laugh as Jack plunged the knife repeatedly back into the man's chest until the man's knees buckled, collapsing him onto the beach. Jack swung around to check he hadn't been observed. Satisfied, he wiped the back of his sleeve across his face, mopping away the blood that had showered him. He looked down and was disappointed to see that the man's head was facing the ground. Using his foot to lever him over, Jack wasn't surprised to find sightless eyes staring back at him. He knew the man was dead. He had felt his life pass from him. But still he waited, watching the blood drip from the end of the blade, splattering the pebbles below. He stooped to wipe it on the small section of the man's shirt that had remained white and carefully, almost reverentially, placed it back in his shoulder bag. As Jack continued walking in his original direction, he could feel the calmness descend. Chapter 2. "Ma'am, take a look at this." D.C. Stepford stood patiently whilst DCI Marlowe carefully read the document he had just placed on her desk. He knew from past experience not to interrupt her when she was concentrating. "What do you make of it?" He couldn't resist asking the question. "In terms of what?" Marlowe replied coolly. "Do you think it might be—" From the very moment he had arrived at the beach in Whitstable, Stepford wondered whether their killer was back in business. It was nearly 3 weeks since the person attacking women in Nottingham had decided to target their city, only to seemingly disappear once more. No one had said it, but he was sure he wasn't the only one who had been hoping he may strike again, so that they would have more evidence to go on this time. "The same man?" Marlowe finished for him, her eyebrows raised. She let out a long sigh. "I really don't see it. Look, I understand why you were looking for the link, though. I had a quick catch-up with DSI Johnson earlier in the week, and she was talking about a murder in St. Albans, claiming that to have been done by our guy. She shared the details with me, but to be honest, I don't really buy that either." "Do you think he just stopped?" Stepford tried hard to prevent any impertinence coming through in his tone. Nevertheless, he waited for some form of rebuke. Instead, he received a simple shrug from Marlowe. "I don't know, but perhaps that's just the very thing. Whoever this guy is, he's committed 4 attacks that are definitely attributable to him, but has left us with very little to go on. For whatever reason, his deliberate disposal of the murder weapon was perhaps a sign that it was to be his last kill. This DCI Johnson doesn't seem to think so. Stepford had been out interviewing local residents when she had come down to check on the investigation, but that hadn't stopped him hearing about her. In the short time Johnson had been at the station, she had caused quite a stir, managing to put a fair few people's noses out of joint. "Are you suggesting I should call her about this?" A hint of menace had crept into Marlowe's voice. "Perhaps you would like to go and visit the DSI and share your concerns about how I am leading this case." D.C. Stepford suddenly felt very uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I wasn't suggesting—" "Then sod off and find out who really killed this man." Chapter 3. The room looked familiar, but Johnson knew the chances of her being in the same one as when she was admitted to the hospital before were slim. Even so, she was still wary that one of the nurses from her previous stay might enter. She tried to sit up, which took some effort, not helped by the effects of the drugs still in her system, but she felt remarkably okay. Johnson guessed it wasn't just because her injuries were lighter than before, the bandages on various parts of her body indicating where she had received burns, but because things were very much different this time. Before, she was having to deal with the death of Macdonnell and the knowledge that his killer had got away. As Johnson reached out with an unsteady hand towards the cup of water on the table next to her, she contemplated how she really felt about what had happened this time in her house. In many respects it was a mixture of relief and regret. Relief that she had survived it and that the sadistic serial killer Brandt was no longer at large, but also regret for how things had played out. For the third time her plan to outwit him had failed. Even if she hadn't learnt from what had happened when he first came to her house, the events in Benidorm should have taught her that Brandt would always remain one step ahead. She wanted to believe her actions had been the result of desperation, but knew deep down there was an element of arrogance. Throughout her life Johnson had viewed failure as a temporary state. If she was unable to do something, she had always shown resilience, resolving that she need only try harder to then succeed. Most of the time she had been right, and every successive reversal in fortune had only strengthened her belief that she could achieve whatever she set out to do. Johnson viewed this personality trait as a quality, but recently it had been leading to the death of others. This time there had been Susan, Brandt's wife. Johnson had yet to receive confirmation that he had killed her, but she knew better than anyone what he was capable of. The other death she was aware of was Brandt's own. This took up the large proportion of the regret she felt. The outcome she had sought may have been the same, but it was meant to be on her terms, not his. She took little satisfaction that his plan to kill them both in the house fire had failed. What he had done was to steal her opportunity for retribution. In a way, it was the final insult. And what had he left behind? Johnson knew she should be grateful to still be alive, but what life could she look forward to? Macdonnell was still gone, her house was now destroyed, and the career she had held so dear was in tatters. Even if none of her actions could be viewed as criminal, she still had a lot of questions to answer, not just in terms of what Brandt was doing there, but also why she had chosen to return to her home rather than remain anonymous and safe in the flat she had rented. Her thoughts were disturbed by the door opening. The flash of a smile confirmed that this nurse was neither the one who had pinned her down and sedated her before, nor the one who had refused to get her some clothes when determined to leave. "Do you think you're well enough for a visitor?" she asked in a soft, soothing voice. "Come again?" "It's fine. I'll just tell him he'll have to come back at another time." The nurse turned to leave. "Who is he?" Johnson called out, and was surprised to find her question wasn't answered directly, more seen as an indication that she wanted to see whoever it was waiting outside. Without reply, the nurse was gone, and the door was about to close again when a male hand caught it. "Hello, Stella." "Gov?" It was DSI Potter. Not only had he come to visit her the first time she had been admitted to hospital, but he had helped her leave, collected items from her house, and booked her into one of the city's many hotels. However, much had changed in the last few weeks. All the apparent kindness seemed to have evaporated on her return to work. He had shown a complete disregard for how she had been feeling, her overpowering need to catch McNeil's killer. Instead, he had put her on some bullshit drug-related case, whilst D.I. Fisher had continued to fuck up the investigation. "How are you doing?" Johnson ignored the kindness in his voice. "Why are you here?" He recoiled from the sting of the accusation. I wanted to see how you are. I care about you, Stella." "Huh," she huffed. "Fat lot you care." "If this is about what happened when you returned to work—" "This is exactly about what happened," she said. Johnson wanted to tell him that because of his cruelty she had been forced to hunt for Brandt herself. If he hadn't made her take things into her own hands, she wouldn't be lying here, her body covered in burns. But she couldn't. She didn't understand why he had been so cold towards her, but he wasn't responsible for what she had done. If nothing else, there was the possibility that if she hadn't made her suspicions known to Brandt in Spain, he may not have evaded the police following the murder of the woman in the caravan. "This is the last thing I wanted for you." Potter seemed genuinely distressed. "I suppose you're going to tell me that's why you kept me off the case." "Exactly," he cried out. "After what happened to you last time, I wanted you as far away from that madman as possible. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to be your friend. Put yourself in my shoes. You would have done the same thing." "But that's the trouble, though, isn't it, Gov? You blurred the boundaries. Your desire to protect me was as a friend, but you used your position of authority to carry it out. That's not fair. That would be like me—" "Like you using your position of authority to keep a young officer you were attracted to close by?" Johnson recoiled as though slapped. The look of horror on Potter's face did not make it any easier. "It wasn't like that," she hissed. "I know, and I'm sorry I said it, but I wanted to show you that things are not as straightforward as you make out. Just go." Johnson could feel the tears beginning to well up and wouldn't give Potter the satisfaction of seeing them again. The last time he had held her and told her it would be okay. Now she didn't want him anywhere near her. "I'll check in to see how you were getting on in a couple of days. I'll try and hold off on you being questioned." Johnson didn't ask him what he was referring to. It wasn't just that she didn't want to delay his departure. She knew exactly what he meant. What she wondered was whether he was telling her this to ensure she used the opportunity to get her story straight. At the moment she couldn't give a toss about how the police perceived her actions, especially not professional standards. But equally she knew there was little to gain from giving them anything to be suspicious about. Her exchange with Potter had left her exhausted, and she was contemplating finding the switch to recline her bed and get some more rest. She was considering whether it would be best to wait for her next load of pain medication, in the hope she may fall into a sufficiently deep sleep that she would not dream. It was rare that the events of Brandt's first arrival at her house didn't revisit her in the night, and she was sure that things would only get worse in the short term as her brain tried to come to terms with what happened when he returned there. She had been around enough officers in her time who had suffered with PTSD to know that it would not be a fast recovery. And yet even whilst sitting up, she could feel her eyelids growing heavy. It was only when she heard a polite cough that she noticed the nurse had returned to her doorway. "It seems like you're quite the popular one today. Got enough strength for another visitor?" Johnson was genuinely curious who it might be this time, even if she didn't fully believe Potter's claim that he would keep officers away from her until she was feeling a little better. She nodded, which was all the encouragement the nurse needed. The woman who entered was instantly recognizable, even if Johnson had only met her once. "Claire?" "Oh, I'm so glad to see you," McNeil's sister said, immediately approaching the bed. Her expression was one of genuine worry, and in complete contrast to the stony determination she had shown in the graveyard. "Look, Claire, I wasn't ignoring your messages. I just didn't want to—" "Shh," she soothed, reaching out for one of Johnson's bandaged hands. "I'm the one who should be apologizing to you. I should have had more faith." Johnson didn't know how to respond. Instead, she continued to stare at her visitor with wide eyes. "You did it, Stella."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?